Hi, so our February rotation is on the book of Judges. The book of Judges, much like the book of Joshua, has some problematic aspects to it. It's pretty violent, but the violence is with a purpose. It's to show that apart from God's guidance and God's direction, people um, tend to wander and tend to go into bad places and become the worst versions of themselves. And so when we can trust in God and when we follow God, we become the best of who we can be. So our lesson sets are going to focus on four of the judges: Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon. Oh, and Samson. I forgot. There's the fifth one. Um, so those are like the most popular of the judges. Deborah and Gideon for sure, and Samson as well are very well known. Um, Othniel and Ehud are not as well known, but they're pretty important stories. So you can find those stories, the actual verses for those stories, in the background notes themselves. The memory verse for this lesson set will be, all you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, which is Philippians 4:9. There's a signing video that's also on the channel that you can check out for more information on that. So our goals this rotation are, one, to make sure that our students know about the book of Judges, that it exists, that it comes after Joshua, and that is in the Old Testament. We wanted them to know the general theme of the book of Judges, which is the idea of there was no king in the land, and the people did as they saw fit. So basically, without God's presence and God's guidance, the people became uh, unruly, became out for themselves. Uh, they'll know the names of Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. They're also going to hear the name Barak, which is interesting, which is where um, the name Barack Obama's name came from. It's from the book of Judges, so they may notice that as well. Um, they're going to learn that they're going to hear often that in those days, the human judges led to violence, whereas if we follow Jesus as judge, we will practice peace instead. So that's going to be the main overview. So a judge in the Old Testament time was more of a military leader or a mayor, more like a general or a mayor would be a good person, or a wise person who was sort of the sage of the group. He was the one, or she was the one, who was entrusted with making decisions in difficult times. The Hebrew word for judge is dean, like Paula Dean. And so that word is used throughout the Bible to mean things like governing or striving, deciding, defending. So that's sort of how they viewed judges. It's not so much about like criminal court cases and like deciding if you're good, innocent, or guilty. That was a part of it. It was much broader than that. So they were more like a governor or somebody who helped make decisions about a more well-rounded topic. Um, by the time the book of Judges happened, we're already settled. Joshua has already come into the promised land. We're settled in the promised land. And now we're seeing what happens when you go from being a nomadic tribe people to being in charge and having to figure out how to set up your society. So they've done all of the stuff in the book of Joshua. They've come into the book of Joshua, and there are still people in the land. And so the Israelites start to worship the gods that are already there instead of the one true God. So that's a theme that runs throughout the book, that they are influenced negatively by the people around them. So there's a couple problems in this book. Obviously, one is it's very violent. God is kind of mean in this story. So God's always coming down on people and sort of saying, like, no, don't do that. No, don't do that. Which gives us a very negative picture of who God is. Judges is a lot about a story about fearing the outsider or the alien, the people that we don't know, who look different than us or worship different than us or talk different than us. So Judges is struggling with the idea of how do you remain truthful or faithful to God while also being enculturated around people who are not like you. They end up saying, like, Judges the book itself often sort of critiques the idea of the people who are living there. So the author of Judges is often saying that they shouldn't be behaving the way that they are in the book. So it's not endorsing the behavior of the people in the book so much as saying, like, look at what they did and don't do that. So Judges is also a pretty funny story. So the story, while we're doing Ehud was they point out one that he's left-handed, and that makes him special. He gets to be left-handed, and the point of his story is that he has a very short knife that he hides on his leg, and he grabs it and goes to stab the king, but the king is so fat, the sword goes all the way in and gets stuck in the king's belly. And so the king eventually dies over time because there's a knife in his belly, but not because he stabs him in the first place, which is pretty funny. There's a lot of stories like that. The women in the story are pretty awesome. They do a lot of really cool stuff. If you read through the whole, or stuff that wouldn't be traditionally associated with femininity anyway. They're judges and they're soldiers and they're fighting alongside the men in the story. So some people would say that we shouldn't talk about the violence around kids, that it's not an appropriate subject for them. But I would say that our kids are very aware of violence and they know that it exists. And so by studying this book, we're showing a different way of approaching life than by being violent. We're saying that these people tried this and it didn't work because look how much more is left. And we know that people can be violent, but God is always present in the midst of that. And I think that's a very powerful message to be telling them. So we're going to be looking at that story through the lens of Jesus, always focusing on who Jesus is and what Jesus would have us do. And is opposed to how the people did things when they were left to their own devices. So that is what Judges is about. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.